So now let's do the sew along for the cowl neck top. Now because this is a cowl, it needs a lot of drape, so when you're choosing your fabrics, choose something like a rayon or a polyester, something with a lot of drape that's going to be really flowy, and you'll get the most out of the effect of the cowl in the front. So this is a woven fabric. We're going to be using our plain sewing machine, so make sure your stitch length is set correctly to 20/5. Also, we're going to need a way of finishing the facing, so I'm going to use an overlocker. Now because it's a woven, we only need 3 threads of overlocking thread, so just set your overlocker up with 3 threads, and you can choose whether you want a wide or narrow, so you can choose to either use the left needle or the right needle. You don't need both. So you can see here the fabric I'm working with is a chiffon. It is opaque, only just, but the facing will certainly help with this. So the other thing I should have mentioned is the front piece is cut on the bias, which means when we go to sew in the side seams, you just might need to do a little bit of adjusting as we go. So the side seams can be a bit tricky, but in general this shouldn't be too bad to sew. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is take the front piece, and we need to overlock across the top edge, so from here all the way through to the other side. So take this front piece and right sides up, just overlock on the edge. Now the other thing about this pattern is I'm only using my overlocker to trim off the stray threads. There's no need to cut any fabric off. Right, so once you have overlocked that, as you can see it's starting to stretch out of place, it's just starting to do a bit of a wiggle. That's okay, don't worry about that for now. As you come down through the armhole, you will see a notch. So that's the fold position. So fold the facing so the wrong sides are together. So this is the right side out facing me, and the facing is on the inside. So fold that there at the notch point, and when you do that, what will happen is the side seams should match like so on both sides. Okay, so this is the front and this is right side up, so there's our fold position there, wrong sides together. So now we're going to sew the side seams. So take your front, place it right side up, take your back, and making sure you know which is the top and which is the bottom, place that right side down. So we have right sides together. So we are going to sew the side seams. So we'll start from this side seam because I just wanted to show you a bit about the bias. Now the bias will make the fabric stretch, and it will also, on a drapey fabric, give it extra drape, which is the reason we get a beautiful cowl. The problem being, when we try to sew it together, you might find that the front needs a little bit more coaxing or help to get it into position. Actually, I'll turn this over so that the this is on top. Okay. So let's start at the underarm edge. And this is probably the worst possible fabric you could choose. Not the worst, the hardest, but it's going to give an absolutely beautiful result. So what I'm going to do is, now as we come down here, you'll see a small notch here. Now that notch there is to show you where the edge of your overlocking should be. So when that's sitting nice and flat, that notch there should be right on, sorry, that edge there should be right on the edge. So what we're going to do is match the underarm point. Now the seam allowances on this, because it's a woven, are 1 centimetre, and 1 centimetre is 3/8 of an inch. Well, close enough too. So when you're ready, I'll just sew a couple of stitches, just do a back tack to start that off. at the 1 centimetre mark. Now, I said that there was a notch there to match that edge there. There's also a notch on the back piece to match that too. So the first thing we need to do is put those 3 layers together, making sure they're exactly on top of each other, and we'll sew through the side seam. And this fabric is even more slippery than I remember the last time I sewed it. Okay, so I'll just sew that to the edge. So now we need to match that side seam into place, and as I said, the bias will make this fabric move, and you can see it already. So to help make sure we ease that fabric into position, and the slipperier your fabric, the harder this is going to be, we're just going to release the presser foot as we go, and that will just help ease in that fabric. So it's no different from setting in a sleeve into an armhole or anything along that line if you just take your time. So I'm going to sew a couple of stitches and just lift up the presser foot to help just ease that in, and a couple more stitches. Now the firmer the fabric, the easier this will be. And when you get to the hem edge, just back tack to finish that. Now I can tell right now that my 1 centimetre 3/8 of an inch seam allowance is a little bit dodgy, so what I'll do is I'm going to go to the overlocker now and tidy that up. I will actually use my blade just to make sure that's really tidied up properly and a nice straight edge. So just as a note, I actually changed to a 4 thread on my overlocker then, just because this fabric is so light. So now just repeat that on the other side. So now we need to put the bias binding tape on, which is going to create the straps and also the armhole finish. So you can either use pre-purchased bias binding, or you can use the same fabric cut into bias strips, whatever you prefer. Now you don't have to use strap adjusters for this, so I'll show you this one without strap adjusters. Clearly if you want strap adjusters, just follow the video for the V-neck, how to put the strap adjusters on. So the only difference is if you don't want to use strap adjusters, just leave some extra. So when I say leave some extra, just make the strap just a little bit longer than you normally would. I've suggested to run on 50 centimeters, so stitch together 50 centimeters, which is 19 and 11/16 of an inch. But if you don't want to use strap adjusters, go maybe 2 inches 5 centimeters longer. So sew up 55 centimeters and go to around about 22 inches before we attach it to the garment. So I've decided to use contrast black because I have quite a lot of black in this garment. So I'm going to use the binding attachment on my machine. Now it really makes no difference whether you use pre-purchase binding or you use the binding attachment on your machine. You can do this exactly the same way, just sewing it together. So if you're using store-bought bias binding, what you need to do is measure out whatever length you want and start sewing it together. So pop a pin in the recommended length and just sew the edges together at an edge stitch. So the binding I'm using is exactly the same weight as my other fabric, but it's just in the a plain black colour. So all I'm going to do is just start my binding off. So So once I've got my bias binding started, what I'm going to do is just sew it together for 50 centimetres. So this is literally just sew a length. And I'm going to get my tape measure and measure that out. And because I've allowed extra bias tape, it really doesn't matter. Okay, so I'm at 14 inches, which is 36 centimetres now. Okay, we're getting there. So we can trim these to size later, but what we need is a minimum of that first amount. So I might just go a teeny bit further, because there we go. Let's have a look, I'll measure that out. Alright, so when you get enough length on that will create your strap, what you need to do is take your garment and turn it so that it is right side out. And then you have to work out which is the left hand side as if you were wearing it. So that's this one here. So once you've done your length, what we're going to do now is put the armhole edge here into the binding and start sewing it around the back of, well, the underarm and then the back of the garment. So for this point you've got to make sure that, and I've done this badly, my notch is not too deep because it won't show particularly, because you'll see the cut and we don't want that. So I'm just going to trim that back slightly, and that's really only because this fabric is just so delicate and so fine that I'm needing to do that. What I'm going to do now is feed this into my bias binding, and clearly if you're using store-bought pre-purchase binding, this is a lot easier. All we're going to do is sandwich that edge in between the layers, and then we want to jam that edge as we sew. So using an attachment like this, the hardest part is just getting started. So all I'm doing is jamming that in there between the layers and continue sewing. Right, so we're going to sew around, and as you can tell, what's happened here is this is becoming the bound edge of our armhole. So here's our side seam, so make sure that that seam faces towards the back and this is nice and smooth. Now if it's not smooth, cut it off and make sure that is secured with a back tack before you go any further. So we're just going to sew on our bias tape across the back. When we get to the other side, we want to make sure all those seams face towards the back of the garment. And then we want to make sure that these edges are nice and tight together. And so all the way up, jamming that in until we get to that notch. And now to create the other strap, we need to do the same amount stitched together as we did on the other side to create the other strap. Okay, so that's how we create these straps for our beautiful cowl. So what we need to do now is make sure our straps are the same length. So take your tape measure and measure out the recommended length. Now bear in mind, if you're using the strap adjuster, you'll be able to adjust it all later. But when you're not, really the length of these doesn't matter as long as they're long enough to go in and secure. So what I'll do for now is match those two edges together, and we'll just go to the end of one and we'll trim the other one off. And the reason I do this is just because it's so much easier to adjust them if they start off by being the same length, because when you try it on you can just snip the same amount off on each side. So I'm going to do the hem now. So I've overlocked that, and I'm going to turn it up by 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 of an inch, and stitch that through the overlocking line. Now if you'd like to, or you'd find it easier, and if your fabric is especially slippery like mine is, you might prefer to iron that into place first. Entirely up to you. As you can tell, I did my overlocking in this creamy colour, and I'm doing my top stitching here in the black, mainly because there's quite a lot of dark colour in this print. So I'm just going to whiz around and do the hem now. So the hem allowance is 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. You could either overlock, turn up 1 centimetre and stitch, or you could do a double fold at 5 or 6 millimetres, which is 1/4 of an inch. So go to your iron and press that hem into place. Now we need to try on our top so we can check the straps are the right length. So try that on and pin them into place, and we'll come back and stitch them in. Okay, so I've gone ahead and pressed the hem, and now I'm working on the strap area. So what I've done is I've put a pin in the back, or 2 pins in the back, at the suggested strap position. Now this is so that the strap will come pretty close to your bra strap on the back of the garment, and it's just an estimated position, but it should be pretty close. So go ahead and mark the strap position in either with a pin or a piece of chalk. So the next thing I did was try on this garment and work out how long the straps are going to be fixed, so these are not having strap adjusters. So my measurement was 32 centimetres, so I'm going to measure out 32 centimetres from the front. So 32 centimetres for me is 12.5 inches. Now this is just personal, it's entirely up to you. So what I'm going to do is now add extra for a seam allowance. So I'm going to allow an extra 1 centimetre, which is 3/8 of an inch. So that's coming into 33 centimetres, which is 13 inches cut. Done. And all I'm going to do now is make sure my other strap is exactly the same length. Now with everything, measure twice, cut once. Be really careful, be nothing worse than having to redo this bias tape. Okay, so I'm just matching them together and cutting them to the same length. So now we need to sew these into place. So the main thing is to make sure that you don't twist the straps as you sew them on. Right, so to show you what I'm doing, here is the right hand strap as you're wearing it, and all I've done is make sure it's nice and straight, so I'll sew it on the right way. So I've allowed 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch, and I'm going to stitch this on. I'm going to stitch it directly on the binding line, and I'm actually going to turn it over, because what I want to do is stitch it through the binding line and then sew it up and hide that raw edge. So I've matched it, and I'm just going to allow 6 mil, just under 6 mil, 1/4 of an inch there, and I'm going to stitch it exactly on the line of the bias so I can hide that. And I'm just going to back tack it, just hold it in place, and all I'm doing now is I'm going to turn that back over on itself so that will hide the raw edges of my strap from the inside. Now because, oh, why hasn't that cut off? It's no good. Because I want this to look really pretty while I'm wearing it, the next lot of stitching I'm going to sew is from the right side of the back, and I'm going to edge stitch it just at the very top of the binding. And I am going to back tack that again, just to hold that into place, and then just do some quality control and snip any stray threads that you might see. And same thing again, just double check that when you're wearing that, that strap won't be twisted. Okay, so now you've done that on one side, go ahead and repeat that on the other side. What I'll do for this is actually turn this one right way out. So that's the way I want it finished, and I'm just going to turn it over there. So of course if you mark this with chalk it might be slightly easier to see the positioning of it. The other thing you want to do is make sure that this is at right angles so that it's not off on an angle at all. Yeah, and then that's turning up on itself like that to hide it, and I will stitch it from the right side. Oh, I've gone a little bit further, so what I'll do is just trim that back a teeny bit. Really my aim is just to hide all those raw edges. That's better. And then stitch on the edge from the top. So go ahead now and do some quality control work, which means trim the threads and give this a really good press, and your garment is finished.